Compass FM. I have in the studio with me the author of a book which is called, I've lost the book now, here it is, Grief on the Run, as he diddle-daddles around here and just tries to make sure that's going to stop, and now we can relax. So Julie Zarifeh is with me in studio, and a very good afternoon to you, Julie.
Good afternoon.
Your book, Grief on the Run, you're launching this book actually at the Waimakariri Library's author talk. It's happening at the Rangiora Library this Friday evening, and we'll talk more about that shortly. But in the meantime, Julie is a consultant clinical psychologist who's worked across a variety of community and district health board mental health teams. And around the time of the Christchurch earthquakes, Julie, I believe you became part of a multidisciplinary team investigating the psychological factors that contribute to what is known as broken heart syndrome. What is broken heart syndrome?
Yes, so broken heart syndrome, I'd known nothing about it despite being a psychologist in the cardiology department for years. So it's up until the earthquakes, it was something that we saw relatively rarely, in Christchurch at least. And it's a cardiac condition where the sufferer experiences the symptoms that very much mimic that of a heart attack, and go to hospital ED sort of thinking they are having a heart attack, and it's not until they've had their kind of cardiology workup and scan that it's diagnosed as this particular condition, which happens at times of acute stress or loss or literally heartbreak. And it's called broken heart syndrome. The Japanese term is Takotsubo cardiomyopathy because the image on the scan mimics that of a octopus pot in Japan, so Takotsubo. So and the good news is people recover. So if you've got the right cardiologist and they pick up that it's broken heart syndrome as opposed to a heart attack, then you're in good hands.
Well, this is a field that you actually studied and became an expert in. And then in 2017, your life changed incredibly dramatically. Tell us about that.
Yes, so, up until then I'd had this sort of growing academic interest in sort of resilience and well-being and in the context of my psychological career, and very tragically in late 2017 I lost my husband Paul to pancreatic cancer. As if that wasn't sad and bad enough, 16 days later my eldest son Samuel was drowned in a rafting accident on the west coast of New Zealand. So the true absolute double whammy, and having to learn to cope with grief from kind of two sides of the playing field. One, the anticipated, sad demise, and then tragic shock, horror.
Did your training in broken heart syndrome, your awareness of that, did it help you at all?
I think, everything I've done along the way has definitely helped me in learning how to manage my own grief process, as a clinical psychologist, and sort of suddenly having to practice what I preach. But yes, having a good awareness of the interplay of our kind of mind-body health has helped.
It's an interesting one because we all have grief in our lives. You've had tremendous grief, absolutely shocking. Do we all grieve in the same way, do you think?
It's a question I'd like to know the answer to also. I don't think we necessarily do, although I would say that probably the physiological process of grief is probably fairly similar. Like, you literally do feel like you've been, hit with a sledgehammer, and I think, part of my message is that it's really is a time to take care of oneself and go back to basics in terms of, those activities of daily living and trying to simplify life as much as possible while you deal with grief. But in terms of strategies for coping with it, I guess my book, Grief on the Run, tells the story of my journey, but how I chose to, the strategies I used to cope with staying alive, actually, or staying, not alive, but staying abreast of things and a functioning member of society, because it was pretty profound.
Well, I can imagine, you used the term staying alive, and I imagine there were times when you felt so low that you wondered what it was all about, really. Having experienced major grief only once in my own life, I just remember there was this light of hope something that you could swim toward like a lifebuoy. There was always this little glimmer. And did you find that there was something that you were trying to reach out to that was telling you to keep going?
Oh, I mean, definitely. I think, pretty early on, I gave myself a good shaking and said, right, what, neither Paul nor Sam chose to die early and in the manner in which they chose, in the manner in which they died. But, what would they want of me and of their survivors, and what would, how do we honour their fantastic lives they'd had, and how do we, keep on living as they would want us to do. So that was kind of my driving force, really. And look, there's always so much to live for, isn't there? Like, so much. We've all got, we will all strike adversity at some point, but we will all can, find definitely lots and lots of things to live for. And yeah.
Because you and Paul, of course, had other children too.
Yes, we did. So I've still got Jared and Christy, and they're fantastic, kids to be proud of, and my grandmother too, with another one on the way. So it's pretty, in terms of things to live for, that's up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Julie, there are certain techniques when it comes to grief. I think of, the 12-step program, perhaps, first there's denial and all that sort of thing. You had trained in this sort of thing. But who helped you? Were there other people that helped you?
So there definitely were. I have a colleague and friend who I work with now, Dr. Lucy Hone of the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience, who was a great role model. She'd suffered her own tragedy. And lots of, both work colleagues and family and friends. You tend to find that times like this, the connections you make are often people who have suffered adversity in some form, and, you kind of bat ideas off each other and learn a lot. But but at the risk of flashing myself, I think a lot was quite self-driven as well. I knew what worked for me in terms of staying abreast of mental health, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, your grief was your own, and no one can take that away, can they? No one can take that weight off your shoulders, unfortunately. So It's just a process that you have to work through. You've clearly done that successfully, although there will always be that grief there, I'm sure, for you. But the way you've worked through that is what interests me, and I'm sure will interest some of our listeners, or anyone who would like to come along and hear you speak. It's the Rangiora Library, and it's this Friday. Julie will be launching her book, Grief on the Run, How Active Grieving Helped Her to Cope with Her Devastating Loss. And you may have mentioned it at the beginning, but that active grieving, if I could just come back to that, could you just define that again?
So I've become famous for this term, active grieving. And in essence, when I mentioned the things that I knew worked for me, one of those things was very much exercise, and just keeping really active and really kind of focused on goals around kind of staying fit and staying healthy. So as I wrote my memoir, I sort of reflected on the fact that the things I did in the wake of losing Paul and Sam were based around very much the theme of staying active and undertaking some reasonably significant kind of physical health challenges.
Because you need to look after yourself, your diet and that sort of thing. And I would imagine, when you've got massive mental stress, it affects you physically too.
It does, yeah. So I just knew that I had to get up every day and walk on the beach and, breathe and eat properly and sleep well and all those fundamentals. But beyond that, I took it a step further, which you will hear about if you come along to the author talk on Friday.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for popping in, Julie. Julie Zarifeh.
Campus FM.